My name is Deon Nel. I'm the Director of Conservation at International. It's really my pleasure to welcome you all here. Very important moment, as I'm sure all of you are very aware and very committed to making this next week a very successful one. But we thought we'd get together here, a WWF organized conference to debate some of the big issues that we think are important over the next couple of days. And so we're very pleased to have you here. I'll welcome you all equally. I will not single anybody out. In true egalitarian spirit, you are all equally special and welcome to this event. We've got representatives from academic think tanks. We've got representatives from diplomatic corps, private sector and civil society groups. So I think we can look forward to a very interesting and important discussion today. A special welcome to those who have agreed to serve on our panels and to stimulate a thought-provoking discussion. We know that you all have very busy schedules and we're very appreciative of your time. Ladies and gentlemen, the sixth Forum for China-Africa Cooperation comes on the back of the adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and is running parallel to the Climate Change Conference of Parties, the 21st Climate Change Conference of Parties being held in Paris. And so there could be no more appropriate time than this to discuss the environmental issues and how we integrate the important environmental issues within such an important relationship between China and Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, WWF believes that the relationship between China and Africa is one of the most important geopolitical relationships as far as global sustainability goes. And this is not only because of the size and the nature of Chinese investments in Africa, and this is what comes to fore in most people's mind when we talk about this. We're set to reach $100 billion investment by direct investment by 2020, so certainly a formidable investment into this continent. But I think more importantly, from my own perspective, is the potential that this relationship has to forge a new development pathway, something different to what has been happening previously and which has been led by the West. And I think this is made possible by two converging factors. Firstly, Africa is at a critical stage in its development pathway. I saw someone say the other day that no other continent has ever changed faster than Africa is changing at the moment. This is a critical time in Africa. Decisions that are being made today by decision makers and leaders in Africa are locking in the future of Africa into different development pathways. So we are sitting at a very, very critical time in Africa's development. And at the same time, we are seeing in China some very interesting developments and policy directions being set around the environment. And here I'm referring primarily to the concept of an ecological civilization, which is gaining traction and coming to the forefront of Chinese policy making. And this concept of an ecological civilization represents a far more fundamental shift, I think, than the concept of a green economy, which suggests, I think, more superficial changes to our economic structure. However, I think it would be fair to say that this shift in Chinese policy has largely, or to a large degree, been driven by needs domestically in terms of environment and the challenges that are being faced domestically in terms of the environment. And at the same time, though, we are seeing the One Belt, One Road policy coming forward in China as well. So we're seeing a renewed and almost larger than ever before commitment towards greater global connectivity. So the greatest risk, I think, is that the concept of an ecological civilization becomes a primarily domestic policy in China. And one could think that a strong domestic policy on environment could, in fact, have a perverse result of ecological footprint being exported elsewhere. So I think it is very important, I think, in our discussions today and our discussions over the next week, that we think and drive home the concept of this ecological civilization, not only being a domestic policy, but one which underpins Chinese overseas investment and underpins China's relationship with Africa. So in that regard, I want to point just to three main areas at the start which are top of my mind, and I think we'll be covering many of these subjects in more detail during the day. Firstly, infrastructure development. This is going to be one of the big change makers in Africa. We know that infrastructure, huge investments planned. We're talking about $400 billion investment over the next 35 years in Africa. And infrastructure affects everything. It unlocks economic potential. It creates much-needed jobs and economic opportunities on this continent. But if planned poorly, and if not planned with the right environmental considerations taken into account, it can have disastrous social and environmental impacts. A recent study being done by scientist Bill Lawrence shows that planned infrastructure corridors could degrade as much as 2,000 protected areas in Africa if they are not planned correctly. And so WWF is working on these infrastructure corridors, and we'll hear more about that work this afternoon. The second issue I want to touch on is renewable energy and the revolution, the energy revolution that's required in Africa. Less than 30% of sub-Saharan Africans have access to modern electricity. And not only does this have huge development implications, but also has huge environmental implications. 80% of Africans living in sub-Saharan Africa are still reliant on biomass or fuel wood for cooking. Now that it would be fine in a population of less than 1 billion on the continent, but when we start getting to a population of 2 billion by 2050 on the continent, that is clearly not going to be sustainable. And so the necessity of an energy revolution which has both a renewable energy revolution which has both development opportunities but also allows the sustainability of our forests and our natural heritage is something which is critically important. And luckily, Africa is blessed with solar irradiation, an abundance of solar irradiation. In fact, 85% of the continent falls into the highest solar irradiation category. And per chance, China is the biggest producer of solar solar PV panels globally. So there's an opportunity here to really leapfrog in terms of energy systems, the same way as Africa has leapfrogged in terms of telecommunication systems, a real opportunity to leapfrog in terms of energy systems. The final issue which I want to just touch on to set the scene for today is the current poaching crisis in Africa. We're going to have a panel on this just after this. But this year the UN passed a resolution, the General Assembly passed a resolution on wildlife crime, which acknowledged, I think, the link between wildlife crime and issues of national security, global security, terrorism, and organized crime. And we're very positive that we are gaining traction in this area. We're also very positive about some of the commitments coming out of China around ivory and the trade in ivory. These are all very promising signs, but I just want to leave you with one point, and that is around urgency. We are losing around 20,000 elephants a year. We are losing over 1,300 rhinos every year. This is not something that we can ponder about. This is not policy that can take 3 to 5 years to think about. The urgency is now to resolve these issues. So I think let's introduce that sense of urgency to our discussions and our policy engagements over the next couple of days.